Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Nash, AAPG, and it is a great pleasure to be able to welcome the presenters today for our GEODE webinar, focusing on subsurface characterization for geothermal resources. And as mentioned before, this is a part of a larger project, and that is GEODE. And I'd like to invite Hinia Torregrosa to describe it and to tell a little bit about today.
Hi everyone, we are very happy to organize this series of workshops along with AAPG. This is part of the disseminations events created by GEODE. GEODE stands for Geothermal Energy from Oil and Gas Demonstrated Engineering, and is part of the U.S. Department of Energy Geothermal Technologies Office. It's one of the programs that is trying to push further the geothermal energy in the US. And what we wanted to, as geoscientists, I'm a geoscientist as well, what we wanted is to create a series of workshops that were practical, that people can have practical takeaways after that. And especially is focused on geoscientists, engineers, or the general public in order to use the knowledge that of the subsurface created in oil and gas and how to transfer this knowledge for geothermal applications. Thank you very much. We are very happy with the attendance of yesterday, and today it seems that we are having more than 200 attendees and more than almost 1,000 people registered. And just to remind everyone that these sessions will be recorded and the presentation distributed, and you can have them afterwards even if you cannot attend today. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And we'd like to welcome Steve Tedesco right now, and he will be talking about geological considerations in converting an oil well to a geothermal well. And there's a lot of interest in this topic, so we're very happy that he's willing to talk about it. So welcome.
Thank you, Susan. Thanks, everybody, for attending. So today I'm going to talk about actually a little bit more than geologic considerations for converting an orphan well or an existing marginal oil well or gas well to being a geothermal well. There's not a lot of real hard data out there yet. This part of the industry is in sort of early stages, and some companies are just keeping everything to themselves. These are just typical geothermal energy production, generally related to power plants or larger facilities. One thing about geothermal wells is that if you drill one, they're far more expensive than a typical oil and gas well, which is one of the restraining costs on keeping a lot of geothermal drill from happening because of the vast difference in cost between a petroleum well and a geothermal well. So the outline today is general considerations. I thought I'd do a brief history of geothermal. Where are the projects being carried out in terms of converting marginal wells or doing orphan wells? How many wells exist that can be repurposed? It's actually a question we really can't answer. Types of systems in terms of binary or single cycle, and then discussions of tax credits and also who owns the rights to the geothermal. Is it the surface owner, the mineral owner, or person owning the water rights, etc. What is the criteria to develop a geothermal energy source from an orphan or existing well? The criteria depend on which article you read and who you talk to. Some criteria are not as important sometimes in some areas as they are in others. And right now we believe there's potentially 2.6 million orphan wells awaiting conversion, and there's probably a lot less than that for a whole variety of reasons. So as an introduction, the Earth gets warmer and warmer the deeper you go. So geothermal is actually a proven energy source, but not cheap to access. A fair amount of industry excitement about converting orphan or existing wells for operators with large fields that are fairly deep, because you really need a minimum of 50 degrees centigrade to really be effectively generate electricity from the fluids in a geothermal well. But it can help drive power and reduce your power costs. And with AI and Bitcoin demanding more and more power, we're going to see shortages in the electrical grid soon enough. As an alternative energy, just like wind and solar, really any renewable energy needs tax credits. Without tax credits, Right now, we don't see how these are going to be that economic, 10, 15, 20-year payouts. Maybe some people can do it for less, but for the most part, like any renewable, the tax credits are what keep the renewable industry afloat. What are the costs to convert a former producer to geothermal? It depends on a lot of things, not cheap currently. Well, I just mentioned that. Also, it seems that no one's got a handle on how to cookie cutter it and come up with a system that can be applied everywhere. Converting is cheaper than drilling a new well by far, but then the new well or even a marginal well has a lot of issues in terms of you may not have enough data, don't know what's really down there. The age of the tubulars in the hole, the cement sheath, etc., all come into play. And then sometimes it may be cheaper to drill a new well. Something that we really can't get away from these wells, regardless, is that eventually you have to plug them. And the states take that up when an operator disappears, but in many cases, a lot of states now are going after previous owners. I'm in one such lawsuit right now. I sold my wells to an operator who went out of business. Now they're trying to come after me in Kansas, but we think that's going to basically go away. What is the criteria to develop a geothermal energy source from an orphan or existing well? And I'll go through that. So the history of geothermal, it's very active in certain countries like New Zealand, around the world. But the field has always faced technical and market barriers and lack of public awareness. Everybody talks about it, sounds like a great idea, but for many reasons, wind and solar are more at the forefront than geothermal. The U.S. is presently experiencing a stagnation in geothermal power capacity and decrease in power generation from 1990 to 2018. I know that's changing, but it's going slowly. About 40% of the U.S. geothermal plants are 30 years old, representing 64% of the total geothermal capacity. And during the 1980s, geothermal development was boosted for heat generation due to high prices of competing heat sources, oil and gas. So if oil and gas goes up, just like with wind and solar, they become closer to being economic than when oil and gas prices are lower. High temperature of the formation does not guarantee a successful project. California has very favorable geothermal gradient and rising demand for renewable energy. Geothermal power generation is declining, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it's the fluid you're moving around. They cause a lot of corrosion, a lot of upkeep, deposit of various oxides and compounds on your piping. And in some cases, you're not getting enough water into the system to be useful. Geothermal exploration can be very challenging. It involves uncertainties in both flow rate and temperature of produced fluids. As recently as with a geothermal project in Indonesia, 2 wells were drilled next to each other deep, but they didn't have a sufficient fluid input into the well bores, so they are not useful. So there's a whole variety of things we have to address. A study commissioned by the World Bank concluded that 22% of all geothermal wells worldwide have failed, with most of the failure coming during the drilling stage. Geothermal drilling is not easy. Usually your holes are far bigger than you'd see in a normal gas well. And as such, also the drilling is typically, if it's not in sedimentary rock, it's in volcanic rock, which has a whole set of issues on its own. Main issue until recently was low temperature, the reservoirs in sedimentary basins. That is changing. We're now down to 50 degrees centigrade. You also get shallow commercial grade, little units that people use to power houses, sometimes going 400 feet. Those systems are very well planned out. They're very economic, but in several cases, for example, in New England and eastern Kansas, people are starting to rip them out because after a few years, they find they're not very useful. But in some areas, they are. Ongoing projects using orphan wells. Start with this was mentioned by Susan on LinkedIn 2 or 3 days ago, so I'm taking this from her. The Tuttle School project in Oklahoma used 4 oil wells at approximately 10,000 feet to provide geothermal energy for a school. Not much is known about this project right now, but it was funded by, I think, state of Oklahoma and the U.S. government. So that helped with the cost. Recently, a group in with the Blackburn oil field in Nevada, which is an old Amoco field and is being operated by a small independent, I believe, out of Denver. They turned one of their existing producers into a geothermal producer. They're going to provide electricity for the field, and I think I saw they were going to put in electric charging stations in the area. Not much information has been released. We don't know what the costs were, if it's really successful, and I believe there was some grants involved. San Joaquin Valley is harvesting electricity through ice thermal harvesting from 11 existing oil and gas wells in California using a new power generation technology. Kern County, Renell converts old wells into gravity storage devices. G2 Watts uses a closed loop exchanger installed in a well to convert into thermal energy storage. The Geothermex field project using Austin Chalk wells, I assume they're horizontal, has demonstrated construction and lab scale testing. One of the issues in converting, which we'll get to later, of oil and gas wells is if you using an existing zone, let's say the field is producing, then you assume the operator has an oil and gas lease. If the field's not producing, it's been abandoned a while, and you're going to use the reservoir that was producing oil and gas before, it's going to probably require you to get an oil and gas lease with the mineral owner, and that might be the same as the surface owner. Subsequently, this can become a real issue for several geothermal operations. The Osage Nation has a big project in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, 40,000 square foot greenhouse. The Osage Nation is actually one of the better tribes in terms of advancing new technologies and not creating issues with outside companies working on the nation. So they're doing a lot of geothermal assessment. It makes sense for them, especially with greenhouses. That's a good choice to use for geothermal. And it's one of the many choices. And one of the things that did come up is that many of the abandoned wells or marginal wells were too old. That's a real issue for this 2.6 million wells that are supposedly available out there. Wyoming has a power plant up there that's produced 2,000 megawatts of power in the first 3.5 years. And then North Dakota has a project. And then internationally, in France, the Vermilion Energy identified a high school for substituting natural gas with geothermal heat from a water co-produced from oil wells. And there's not many fields in France, so I'm assuming this might be either in the Paris Basin or down in the south where they have their large gas field. Now, this is a map that's showing worldwide hydrocarbon fields that have been analyzed or a pilot been put into for geothermal operations. You can see the Russians are doing it, the Chinese are doing it. And the nice thing about Russia and China is they just go at it. They don't necessarily are economic. They don't worry about the economics, like they're putting in wind and solar now left and right, and also coal-fired plants just to keep energy going in both countries. But in the US, there's more and more plants that are being developed. How many wells are really out there? Well, let's take a look at that. 2.6 million offering wells in the US. Some people say 3 million. Some people say less than 2. Many of these offering wells are too old. We can't find them. They don't have any data. A whole slew of issues. They're too shallow. You really need to be more than 2 kilometers deep for most geothermal to work. So that eliminates a lot of areas in the country in terms of shallow wells, abandoned orphan wells. Orphan wells in most states typically are very shallow wells. Those operators just disappear. They're small mom and pop operations. When you get into the deeper wells, you've got companies that typically they only walk away from their wells if they go bankrupt or for other reasons. But typically, the deeper the well is, the more likely it's plugged. Offering wells at least have the wrong casing size. Below 5.5 inch pipe, from what I understand, and maybe someone on the talk here has some different information. It's hard to do anything with a well that's 4.5 inches or smaller. A lot of my wells, I do oil water floods as well as gas wells. But my oil wells and the water floods, because they're at 210 to 600 feet, the injectors have 1 inch poly in them, and then the production wells in the oil field have 2 7/8, and those you definitely cannot do any geothermal as with present technology. So you have X number of orphan wells not near an end user. That's another problem if you're in the middle of Kansas or middle of central Illinois or Indiana. The well may be miles from any real end user. Using it for a local homeowner, that can be very expensive, and they just may not want to deal with it. So you have a wide number of useful wells, and that's probably in reality less than 50,000 and maybe a lot less. So what you want to really look for is the deeper wells greater than a mile, 7,000 feet to convert to geothermal. Existing wells, several hundreds of thousands of active wells in the US and Canada. Many fields have marginal wells in them that are shut in or just waiting on workovers or better prices. We look for those marginal wells in the field. Convert a strong water producer to geothermal. The amount of water flow, several tens of barrels a day. If a well is only making 3 or 4 or 5 barrels a day of water or fluid, then it's probably not useful. Most cases, the operators are using this to generate electricity to reduce costs. They also could do it to put into Bitcoin, help put in Bitcoin and AI. And if they're making more money with these wells, you have a happy operator. So there's 3 types of geothermal classification: high temperature above 150, which is the optimal temperature to be for many geothermal projects. The medium temperature is okay, 90 to 150 degrees centigrade, and low temperature, 30 degrees to 90 degrees centigrade. Right now, I understand there's really no projects below 50 degrees centigrade, but there are systems like the shallow ones used for homes that are put in, not with an oil and gas well, but just put into maybe 30 feet or down to 400 feet. And those are the ones probably working well at the lower temperatures. So this is Lindell's diagram of geothermal energy use, and you can see as you go up in temperature that you can do a lot more. Basically, your conventional power plants are above 140 degrees. Your binary power plants, which are more efficient, have a wider range because they use 2 different cycles, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So as I put on the left side, the shallow wells in eastern Kansas, Illinois, and some parts of Texas, or any shallow area, falls in the lower range. And then the deeper wells and deeper plays, and I just put some of them, there's a lot more, fall in the higher range, so 10,000, 15, 20,000 feet. So here's single cycles, and this is what we're looking at for most orphan wells. You don't see many orphan horizontal wells. I can think of a handful in Kansas. I'm not sure about the Permian, but essentially it's just basically you circulate water down the backside and bring it up through the tubing to the surface into a heat exchanger and then drop the water back down. Horizontal can do the same thing, and as we'll discuss, some of the problems with the horizontals is they're in oil zones, which involves the mineral estate, and so I'm not certain that horizontal wells are going to be very useful. And many of these horizontal wells are out in the middle of nowhere, like North Dakota and Permian Basin. Now, these could be useful in the Barnett area for generating geothermal because the Barnett is pretty much right in Dallas and in Fort Worth area. So it'll have more end users available to absorb the power. Now, another thing we can do with orphan wells or even marginal wells is take an injector and producer well in a field, and you can do it with orphan wells here, and just push the water down into one and then pull it out from the other. There's many shallow reservoirs you can do this with, but as deeper you go, the porosity and permeability change, and you really want high porosity and high permeability in doing geothermal. It helps move fluid out of the reservoir into the well bores. Tight sands or tight carbonates are not necessarily good candidates, and you may have to frack, and that may add costs that just don't make sense. Now, geothermal plants are using what I just showed in terms of like a water flood, but essentially they have ejector and producers, and these have to be sometimes re-drilled or reworked and that sort of thing. Binary cycle seems to be the most efficient cycle. It was first used in Italy in 1940, right at the start of the World War II. We don't know much about it. But essentially, it seemed to work effectively for several years. As of December 2014, 203 binary cycles, and this may be systems that may become useful in marginal and orphan wells. 35% of all geothermal, and it's generating 10.4% of total geothermal power. So that basically what you do is you circulate the hot water, it comes to a heat exchanger, becomes cold, and then you put it, you pressure it up and put it back into a heat exchanger, and it generates electricity again, and then goes back down the wellbore. So geothermal orphan or existing well evaluation. Well, it depends on the geothermal resources, hot water, steam. Very two different things in terms of what's the type of tubulars you need, all sorts of other issues. And in some cases, a lot of orphan wells are not able to do the steam simply because they don't have the right casing. Typical casing in Kansas, 4.5 and 5.5 inch, rarely is generally it's just normal API, I think J55 or something like that, where it doesn't have any special qualities. I buy used a pipe like that, and I know that under hot water conditions, the tubulars would fail eventually. It needs to be extracted safely in a manner that doesn't jeopardize the well stability or the surrounding environment. More importantly, you want to make sure your people won't get burned. You have to determine what you're doing the geothermal power for. If it's for a greenhouse, it's one thing. If it's for a small town, that's another. It's just a matter of sizing the equipment at the surface. And then monitoring, maintaining the fluids especially can start depositing because of the rapid changes in temperature at the surface, or just changes coming up the well-bore because there will be changes in pressure and temperature. You might start creating scale, deposits of various oxides, and corrosion of the pipe. And if you have any H2S, you got other issues. And then on top of that, if you're in an old oil zone, you might be generating oil. And if you use a gas well, which is always viable, you might be generating gas. And what do you do with that? Site evaluation. Many wells, like in eastern Kansas or central Illinois, the pad is probably less than a quarter of an acre that the well sits on, whereas in deeper wells, like I've drilled in southeast Colorado, the pad is probably half an acre at times. And so also it's high plains desert, so you have different environmental conditions. The seismic risk, I don't really think is an issue in most sedimentary basins. That's more in volcanic terrain, or like on the front range of Colorado, where if you're injecting, and the person previously talked about it, it's actually what helped understand what was going on in the Mississippi and Chat Play in Oklahoma with the earthquakes and injecting fluids and causing fault activity. But in most cases, because these small wells, orphan wells, are typically small, and the amount of fluids being circulated is probably not going to create any seismic. Environmental impacts, it depends upon the state. Some states are overly aggressive in terms of having all sorts of requirements in terms of forms, studies, and that sort of thing. Even the federal government, even if they're old wells, they will want you to have a NEPA survey, even though it's clear the well may have been producing 50 years. I've actually gone through that for other things. Site evaluation. First step is the detailed evaluation of the site's geothermal potential. That makes a lot of sense. Geologic surveys, existing data. That's a problem for orphan wells in many states, especially the older they are. Many states really did not require collecting information for decades until the 1980s, when the first boom, or late 70s, and suddenly the states realized they needed to collect data to keep up with what's going on. Regulatory approval. Some states, like Kansas, they don't have many geothermal, if any. So simply they're not used to geothermal yet. They do have a tax credit that expires next year, but many states, and especially not in the oil and gas areas, don't have rules or regs in place. So they're feeling their way through it. Some orphan wells, the state may not want you to convert at all, simply because they want it just plugged and be done with. Reconditioning or reinforcing the well. This is critical, especially if your tubulars are very old or old. Typically, converting an existing well A lot of people like that because hopefully you've got a well that's less than 12 years old or less than 5 years old. You can be pretty sure the cement is still well bonded to the pipe, and the pipe is still in good condition downhole. And then the last is the geothermal plant requirements. It just depends on the size of the amount of energy you want to generate. And in terms of the word power plants, that's probably not applicable here, but providing power to either the existing oil and gas field or to a homeowner or to a small business. Those power plants are small. Transmission lines and connections. This is what makes a lot of the orphan wells not useful, is because they're too far from transmission lines. They're too far from the end users. So a lot of times these orphan wells and even the existing wells have to be close to where they're going to be used. So, and I've got references at the end of this where a lot of this stuff has come from. And in all honesty, a lot of the criteria varies between different authors, probably based on their experience in what basin or geologic area they're working. As I said earlier, well depth has to be greater than 2 kilometers. Your fluid rates have to be pretty good. Something doing 10 barrels a day is probably not going to be useful. Something doing 500 barrels a day is more likely to be useful. The well age, younger is better. Good cement bond. So if you go into an orphan well with no data, you're obviously going to have to run a CBL log or bond log. You might even run a temperature log. You might do a whole variety of things downhole. You might collect samples of the fluids and the gases, because all of that impacts how the well is going to perform and how long you're going to have stable tubulars in the hole. Horizontal versus vertical. I don't know of any horizontal wells being thought about converting. If someone on the call here does, I'd like to know about that. Typically, they're all vertical. Larger casing diameter, the bigger the casing, the better. That's why I said below 4.5. I don't think right now we have the systems that work. And then well location, obviously, you don't want to put this, next to a national forest, because I think you get a lot more issues than if you put it into an area that's heavy into oil and gas. Bottom hole temperature greater than 70 degrees. It can be lower, but essentially this is why a lot of the wells in eastern Kansas, orphan wells or even existing wells, I don't think the temperature runs above 85 degrees Fahrenheit in many areas, so they're not really that useful. You have a variety of potential reservoir formations. Once again, it goes back to the porosity permeability. You need it at a high end. And so unfortunately, the deeper you go in the section in many basins, the porosity and permeability gets less and less and may require fracking. Well is not abandoned. That's the author of this study was talking about converting wells in an existing oil field. He prefers not having them inactive less than 12 months. Well is not suspended. In states like Kansas, that's not an issue. They'll let you restart a well even if you originally put it on a plug-in abandoned list. I've had experience with that, but there's other states like Michigan or California that take a different attitude. Well owner interested in green energy transition. I think it really should say well owner interested in making additional revenue. Green energy transition is great, but most of the people out where oil and gas is are more pro making money out of their mineral estate or their groundwater or whatever else. Environmental, no past leaks or spills. Well, that's not really a liability issue. It may be on federal ground, it may be in some states, but in most states, if you had previous leaks and spills at the surface and they've been cleaned up, you're probably good to go. This is from a different author, wellbore reentry and use case. One's on for an orphan well or a shut-in well, and then the other one's just for a general well that's producing. One of the issues we'll talk about momentarily is producing from a depleted hydrocarbon zone. It goes to, who owns the minerals, and if you're damaging an oil reservoir that someone could argue they can come back to later, you'll have a hard time using an abandoned well or existing well in a depleted reservoir. some wells are just, they didn't find a trap, they didn't find hydrocarbons, so they're just down in the deep aquifer, so they may have optimal for doing this. You also have to look at, with these old wells or even existing wells, you might have to have an aiming plant put in place to pull out the CO2. You might, I don't know if this will happen, but you might find some helium, so you want to put in a plant there. But you also want to maybe strip out some of the salts that are in the fluids or rare earths, because those can cause problems in the tubulars, but at the same point, they can provide another revenue source. So sort of a short summary: age of wells, cement bond, downhole data, reservoir characteristics, subsurface geology, engineering, production history, if known, gas and fluid analysis if available. And a lot of this stuff is critical in many orphaned wells, and even some existing wells, that data is not there. As a small operator, I collect a lot of data, but a lot of my fellow small operators don't collect any data. So when they try to sell their properties, they have problems because they think it's worth $1 gazillion, but no one offers them more than 100,000. But if you have a lot of data, then it makes them easy to evaluate it, so you can get closer to agreeing on the price. Now, this is a checklist from another author on the wellbore list for wellbore conversion. You can see there's a whole group of things that you need to look at: outer diameter of the casing, inner diameter of the casing, and all of these come about in the calculations of doing a geothermal project. And some of these things is some of the casing you may not be able, you have to go in and run a CBL, because sometimes you may be looking at one casing and you may have it tapers down below to another size casing. So there's a lot of technical data that needs to go into this. Then back to the fluids. Some of the fluids they use to circulate, natural water and brines is the obvious one. One project was using ethyl chloride, water brine with ammonia. Ammonia is great at carrying hydrogen. Fresh water, you might put in fresh water to reduce the TDS and the fluids that are being circulated in order to minimize problems with the tubulars. But as I state here, there's a lot of things you may want to drop out of the fluids that can provide you with other sources of revenue, and some people are trying to do this. Some of the main problems with what's in the wellbore is the hydrogen ion, chloride, sulfate, dissolved CO2, and H2S. And you hopefully never have H2S, because that really presents a lot of problems. Now, if you're producing from an existing reservoir and you've got oil that may be circulating out, this is sort of like a gas storage. There's several gas storages in the U.S. One I can think of, the McLeod Field in northeast Kansas that Williams/Southern Star owns. They have to separate the oil out when they extract withdraw the gas during the winter months, and they make quite a bit of oil that they have to pay royalties to the landowners. And this is a big fight for the gas storage and the operators in the 80s, because there's several that were producing oil and they just assumed that was their money. Several landowners sued, and royalty owners rather, and they won their cases. But that's something that has to be considered. Natural gas can be helped to generate power. If you can't, you need to put it back in the ground, because a lot of states will not allow you to flare anymore or vent. CO2 can be captured and put back in the ground for tax credits. And also it can be processed for certain grade industries, for certain grade. Food grade CO2, I understand, gets about $690 a ton or something like that. At least that's what I heard at another conference. So there's a lot of options that can go along with the geothermal. Now, here's the biggest problem, is the legal and regulatory approvals. I mean, to me, the science is simple, the data is simple, but the ownership, liability, existing wells, what zone will be used, the permitting, these are more of the hassles. These are more sometimes nebulous and hard to quantify. Every state's different. The federal government's different. The provincial governments are different. So it's just what rules they have into place, what their history is with mineral states, who owns the surface rights, who owns the water rights. For example, wind and solar go with the surface rights, And as I'll show momentarily, the geothermal is sort of all over the board. It depends on which state you're talking about. So Texas is the surface owner that owns the geothermal rights. Utah, you have to be above 120 degrees. So if the water is not above 120 degrees, then I guess you can't do geothermal. California, the mineral owner owns any heat, everything associated fluids and minerals except hydrocarbons. Hawaii, the mineral owner owns any heat associated fluids. There so far is no hydrocarbons in Hawaii. But Pennsylvania, it's complex and typically requires a lease or conveyance to be very specific. Colorado is the surface owner. The U.S. government, and I'm sure the Canadian government, are pretty set in how they see. They lease geothermal rights. They lease rights for specifically nickel, vanadium. So they have a more control and constant way they handle this. Non-petroleum states, if someone was to drill a 10,000 foot up in New England somewhere, I don't know what they would do. But they're putting in the shallow geothermal, so they'll probably just, whoever owns the mineral rights, which they really have split minerals, owns it. And then California, to give you an idea of the royalties on state lands, they can take up to 42% of the electricity value. So it's pretty high royalty at times. So states that do, and provinces that offer or do not offer geothermal credits. So the first list above is the ones that don't have it, based on what I looked up. Now, someone else may know that some of these do or don't. And then all the others, it's all over the board. But what right now is very compelling for anybody doing geothermal is that the federal IRA program provides 30% tax credit anywhere. So there's that. But as you can see, there's a lot of variability. Like Kentucky only has a $250 tax credit. Kansas expires next year. And some have very complex tax credits that I didn't get time to really take apart and look at. Finally, one more flow chart as we get near the end. And this is just another way to look at how you put this together to develop a geothermal project with either an orphan well or an existing well, or maybe a brand new well. But it just gives you an idea of all of the steps that you really need to look at. Some are in certain areas are not as important, for example, seismic risk, whereas in other areas, if you're putting in the Salton Sea area, then seismic risk is a concern, or in the LA basin. So in summary, economic viability, the cost of converting an orphan well to geothermal can be significant, and the economics of the project must make sense in comparison to other renewable energy sources. There's a really a small group of people in the industry who are really pushing to convert all orphan wells for some other use. And in reality, many of the orphan wells are not going to be useful for anything other than to put cement to them. So you have to be very diligent in terms of how you evaluate your geothermal well, because more than likely it's not going to work out with an orphan well. Regulatory hurdles, it just depends upon the state. Resource uncertainty, like I said, there's probably 2 million wells, if not 2.5 million wells, that are just not going to be worth anything. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Wow, lots of information, very practical. You have some questions in the chat. Let me look through. Oh, you've got a compliment. This presentation is the best I attended that combines technical and economic knowledge. So that's
great.
nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean and that's one thing that is really nice to see, the practical elements. And you can stop sharing your screen so that I don't have to
I
myself. Oh,
didn't I stop sharing it?
no, it's still sharing. Now you're sharing your desktop, and I'm looking huge. Okay, well, at any rate, yeah, well,
Still huge?
yeah, never mind. You can go back to your sharing. Okay, so let's look at a couple of questions. So Jeremy Boak points out that 10 liters per second equals 5,434 barrels per day. Some modular geothermal systems can make 100 kilowatts from 2,000 barrels per day if the water is 135 degrees Celsius. That's
Well,
interesting.
yeah, that's interesting, but there's not a lot of vertical wells that can really do that.
The only ones I can think of are the ones that are doing like hunt and dewatering.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
they have like a 2%, 5% oil cut.
Right.
More like in the Stack or the Mississippian. The only drawback with that is they can be super high in TDS. So
Right. So
that
you might have to evaporate it out or put fresh water in your system to dilute it. The
well, then you
horizontal
lose your
wells,
energy. You'd have to harvest your energy right when it comes out and with the
right.
heat exchanger. But then you have to have a heat exchanger that loves terrible water.
Yeah. Well, some of the Mississippi and chat wells in south central Kansas and northern Oklahoma were making 5 to 6,000 barrels a day of water. So
Okay.
but those are horizontal, and once again, you go back to um, you need an oil and gas lease to because you're going to pull some oil out of there through time, even if the well is uneconomic as an oil producer.
Well, and that leads to another question that we had in the chat. The idea of co-production, and that's exactly what that would be. But then the second kind of quirky and neat, yet to be tested issue in the Oklahoma situation is that right now you cannot produce geothermal from an oil zone because of the potential for damaging the zone, the
Right.
oil production. So I think that this would need to have a special case of co-production. Very interesting.
There was a question about geothermal being as reliable in solar and wind. I I don't know how to answer that question. The fact that there's not a lot of geothermal conversions going on right now, the answer may be no, or maybe it's early stages.
Well, and in terms of dispatchable energy, I would say that geothermal wins hands down because it's not intermittent. But in terms of long term, depending on the type of reservoir, it just depends on what it is. Because as we found out yesterday, there were so many different types of geothermal reservoirs. But then in the case of converting, okay, here's a question. How does surface casing vent flow impact your criteria?
The surface casing, how does it affect the? Well, once again, it's a tubular that you're going to look at because you're going to, in a lot of the shallow wells, they only have the surface casing and then production casing. So you're going to have to look at that surface casing, which, quite frankly, is typically low grade because normally you don't think of it being part of the production flow for an oil and gas well. So that's something you have to consider. Some people use a culvert. Historically, they put a culvert down 20 feet. And so that's not exactly the best quality casing. My experiences is the 20 feet we put in Kansas because we cement the surface, it gets covered by the cement sheath when you put the production casing in. And once again, it still has to be looked at in case you have corrosion in the production pipe. And then you got to make sure that you're not going to have leaks to the surface. And I saw someone ask about the references. If you send me your email, I'll just send you the references.
And somebody mentioned, you mentioned something about the Tuttle project.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so those are those references are available. Saeed Salehi and Cesar Vivas published on that, and that you can find them in One Petra because they published them through the Society of Petroleum Engineers. So if you want to contact me, I'll find those. Here's a quite challenging question for you. When CO2 is present in geothermal production fluids, is this beneficial or harmful in generating greater temperature and electricity potential?
I don't know the answer to that question. CO2 is just, an acidic, and it's going to damage your tubulars more. And that's more of my concern than whether it's going to help increase the heat or not. I want to get rid of the CO2.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, do you have a specific workflow for oil and gas? Oops. Somehow I lost it disappeared I was reading it and it disappeared. Oh, Anina Peterson said, yes, geothermal is a baseload power source, not intermittent like wind and solar. Geothermal currently accounts for 0.44% of power in the US, with 4 gigawatts online. However, a recent paper in Nature from Stanford estimates the power potential for EGS, enhanced geothermal systems, in the US alone at 36,000 gigawatts. Wow, thank you, Anita. That's perfect. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Well, I'll answer that question by saying is right now in the hydrogen industry, half of the country is potential for hydrogen. Half of the world is a gazillion grams of hydrogen that would change the world. But unfortunately, we can't get it out. And so the same thing I see with people proposing those sort of things is, okay, so how do we get that out? And right now, as just said, geothermal is only a small part of our energy mix. The U.S. is actually the largest geothermal producer from what I saw in the data, and we still haven't gone very far. So I think it's going to be a while before we actually maximize the geothermal potential of the U.S. and Canada or even Mexico, simply because the systems they're not consistent, they're costly, you need tax credits. To me, yes, they will come down. I mean, people are arguing wind and solar is more economic than oil and gas, but if you take away the wind tax credits or the solar tax credits, they're suddenly more expensive. And for some reason, if they're so economic, why do the rates in California and Germany keep going up? Because they have wind and solar, same in Spain. So, I mean, I just don't understand those economics, but I think it's going to be a while before we see geothermal in a and being used nationwide.
Well, I take issue with that in the sense that it depends on what kind of geothermal you mean. So if we look at ground source geothermal,
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about
okay.
the stuff. I'm talking about the stuff.
Yeah, so you raise an interesting point because I was recently at a summit and they were talking about geothermal power and the issue of microgrids and the turbine. And so natural gas has a long wait for turbines, like 6 years, because there was not a lot of demand for them, so that now there's suddenly demand. But for geothermal, if you're using steam, apparently there's a much lower wait time for steam generating or reciprocal engines. So if you can do the microgrids, then those are easier to implement. And when you're talking about how close you are, that kind of helps some of the problems because then that way you can get your energy to, say, remote locations that actually are very far away from any major transmission lines. So I see it as something really worth investigating.
Well, I think geothermal is worth investigating, and I think it prevents an add-on to the existing fossil fuel system. And that's what we're now realizing about solar and wind is it's an add-on. It's not going to replace it. Germany is now getting rid of their wind assets and putting in coal mines and looking at keeping nuclear. And that's because they were paying 60 to 65 cents a kilowatt hour. And it was not sustainable for the economy. People just were not having any discretionary cash. I think also the Forge project in Utah, at one point, I remember was already at $435 million, and they called it a success. Well, that's not a success. I mean, they have to get those costs down to into like the $10-15 million range of drilling and completing wells. Otherwise, and they've done that in the shale business. They've gotten so good at putting those wells in and fracking them, even though the wells cost $10 or $12 million in some areas, they're economic. when the oil's at $70 or dollars a barrel, maybe not at 50. But so the industry has to become more efficient and more cost effective in putting in their systems. And until that happens, we're not going to see geothermal sweep across the countryside and people converting to it.
Exactly. And so Jeremy Bogue points out that Fervo is now selling energy from an ESG project. That's very true. And Devon is a big partner in that, and they're continuing to explore and put in more. And this whole issue of the more we cross-pollinate with technologies from other industries, oil and gas, as well as mining, the better. And I know that in the projects and the things that we partnered with Geothermal Rising, it was so interesting to see the cross fertilization of ideas. At any rate, any final thoughts? And your approach is practical. One thing that takeaway that I have from what your presentation is that orphan wells are going to be tough to convert over, but
Right.
drilling fresh wells is often the best way to do it.
That's well, I take that approach when I find an oil.
Your audio went out. You might have to repeat that, Steve. Your audio went out.
Okay, so my experience has been in doing oil and gas wells where I find an old well is just to drill a new one, because I'd say only 10% of the time have I effectively reused an orphan well. And then you mentioned Devon. See, that's where things will change in the geothermal business, is getting companies like Devon, Apache, Exxon, all the bigger companies who know how to bring costs down and bring cash to bear to make it work. You know, someone like my company is small. I've got 6 employees, and so we don't have the cash flow to go around trying to convert unless it makes some real sense, because the heat exchangers and all the other equipment is expensive for us.
So Kellen from yesterday is here today, and Kellen, I just made you co-host so you can speak on the Forge and the fact that it was a research project and what's going on and the new breakthroughs.
Oh, yeah, I was just talking about the cost of Forge. I don't remember the exact cost, but it was, a research project. And so a lot of the costs were loaded up on universities and national labs,
Well,
doing research and various things. But I'd
university
say,
projects are always a success.
yeah, right. So they're more focused on, I think, technical success.
Right.
I think the cost success is, if you look at Fervo, they've actually published a lot of data showing their drilling cost curves have come down significantly. And so I know that Tim Latimer and Jack Norbeck, they published some white papers and have been really open about that data and refer everyone to it. I mean, I think there's still, the jury is out in many ways on their project, but I think that's a commercial project that is a better comparison to look at costs of EGS development.
Yeah.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying is that there's several geothermal projects that have been very costly. MIT is out there trying to raise $500 million to drill, I think it's a 30,000 footer somewhere. And it's just, those type of costs are not sustainable if you're trying to convert the U.S. energy economy to something different other than coal, gas, and oil.
Well, I think a lot of people are all of the above types, and it depends on where you are in terms of what you have access to. So, I mean, but I mean, oh my gosh, what great points. And thank you, Steve. These were really
Good.
interesting points. Great presentation, great discussion. And I think we're all really, really excited about geothermal, excited about what's happening, and really looking at it clearly to see where the comparative advantages are. It's wonderful.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh,
Thanks
thank you.
everybody for listening.
Thank you.